Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And I would like to welcome you to my session with Jonny Steinberg, our conversation. I am Hlonipha Mokoena, and I'm an associate professor at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of the Witwatersrand. And it is my pleasure and honor to introduce you to Jonny Steinberg. And I will quickly just give you his biography. So Jonny Steinberg is the author of several books about everyday life in the wake of South Africa's transition to democracy, a two-time winner of South Africa's premier non-fiction prize, the Sunday Times Ellen Payton Award, and an inaugural winner of the Wyndham Campbell Literature Prize. Until recently, until 2022, he was a professor of African Studies at Oxford University and currently teaches part-time at Yale and at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research in Johannesburg. It gives me great pleasure, Jonny, to be here with you discussing Winnie and Nelson, Portrait of a Marriage. And before I start, I'd like to tell you a little piece of the conversation that Jonny and I often have whenever he publishes a book. I always look at him and say, when I grow up, I want to be Jonny Steinberg.
First I've heard of it.
So I am trying to express my absolute awe and admiration for you, Jonny, and what you have achieved in this book. I think what you have done in this book is elevate political biography in South Africa to a level that most of us will only aspire to. And in fact, what your book made me think about was the fact that South Africa needs its own Pulitzer Prize. So when I was reading this, I was like, Pulitzer Prize, please, someone.
Thank you.
We need kind of this brave and forthright writing and this cutting edge, this totally visceral way of reading a book in which you are so profoundly moved that actually you throw the book at the wall because you are so profoundly emotional when you read the book. The only comparison that I can think of is David Blight's biography of Frederick Douglass, which I read and I had to put down, and I read and then I would put it down just because it is so painful that I actually couldn't read it. You cannot read 200 pages at a time. And this is about expressing this almost visceral reaction to the book in which you feel so profoundly, almost ashamed of yourself. When I was reading the book, I felt profound shame because it felt like I was interrogating the Mandelas again, that I was behind that one-sided glass and I was listening to their conversations and I would say to myself, shame on you. And I would put the book down and I would walk away and then I'd say, but I want to know what happens. Right. And so that sense of shame when you read a book, that actually you are complicit. So regardless of which side of the barricade you are on, that you are complicit in somehow prying on the private life of this couple. So for me, the first question for you is, would it have made a difference if the book was Nelson and Winnie? Why did you choose Winnie and Nelson?
Well, first, thanks for the really, really lovely introduction. I appreciate it. You know, to be honest, at the beginning, I was going to write a book about Nelson Mandela, and the reason was quite simple. It's that I didn't think it would have been possible to write about him honestly and truly and deeply while he was alive. I think that to write about him as a real human being would have been to attack him. And so I thought, now that he's gone, there's a possibility of looking at him as a human being. And one of the first things I discovered in the research is, and it was really quite a shocking thing to discover, was how his very sense of being became entwined with Winnie while he was in jail. You read those letters and you're quite startled that this man needs this relationship in order to be. He's getting, the longer prison goes on, the more deeply in love he becomes with his wife. And yet, at the same time, he no longer knows who she is. The years that they've been together are receding and receding, and what's really in his head is a fantasy of a woman. And the actual human being who is coming to see him is somebody else. It's not the person in his head. And at that moment, I thought this book isn't about him, it's about them. It's about the marriage. It's the most extraordinary subject for a book. It is the strangest thing that happened to two human beings. And so it started as Nelson and Winnie, and I can't explain why. It's, as she became the dominant figure in his head, and then for a long time the dominant figure in the book, it became Winnie and Nelson. It just intuitively, ineffably for reasons I can't really explain, seemed correct.
I'm glad that you said, because then I was going to ask you the other question. What difference would it have made if it was Nelson and Winnie? But I think you've answered that question. And the one guess that I wanted to take was also about the fact that when a great man is written about, his personal life is almost always obscured in one way or another, which is why I think the Frederick Douglass comparison is so apt, is because in that book, David Blight actually does exactly what you did. He looks at the personal life of Frederick Douglass, beyond the great orator of the 19th century. I mean, if any of you have not, if you haven't read Frederick Douglass's writing, he's one of the best writers who has ever lived. And yet, his personal life was in total shambles. His children financially depended on him. They could never get a job. They could never have a career. And part of the reason they could never have a career is because his name followed them around. So in some ways, what you do in the book is to show that the Mandela name is both a blessing and a curse. And it was a curse for both of them. So despite what it achieved, despite the international fame, in their own personal life, they were so distraught, they were falling apart, the family was falling apart. And the question for me is, what about the ethical issues? Did you feel ethically compromised, sort of reading, for example, all the transcripts of the visits of Winnie and family members to Nelson Mandela on Robben Island, and literally having almost like a word-for-word transcription of what happened?
Let me start by what you were referring to first, which is the private and the public.
Right.
I don't think that one can fully appreciate Nelson Mandela. We'll talk a great deal about Winnie soon. I don't think one can understand Nelson Mandela as a public figure and as a political figure properly without understanding his private life, and for many, many reasons. One is that as those years went on in prison, he increasingly understood himself as the head of a family, which was quite ironic because he was a terrible, terrible father and husband when he was free.
Right.
And he became this conservative, almost boring family man in prison. His wife and children began to mean everything to him. And that is so inseparable from his politics. I mean, he led an armed struggle and was a revolutionary, but his sense of the world was very much conservative with a small c.
Right.
He was somebody who wanted to preserve things. His relation to the world was quite quiet in a way. And another reason why the private is so important is when he came out of prison, he was reeling psychologically and emotionally. He really hadn't found his feet, and yet he was also one of the most powerful human beings on the planet. And that combination for a couple of years was dangerous. He did abuse his power quite severely in those first 2 years to try and save his wife and his marriage. And so that connection between the private and the public is there's more to say, but let me stop there.
Right.
The ethics. So, sorry, let me stop doing that.
Yes.
So, just to explain the background, about halfway through writing this book, I discovered that all the conversations that Nelson and Winnie had when she came to see him in the last decade of his imprisonment had been recorded and transcribed. And I was able to see them. Not always transcribed, sometimes inadequate summaries were made, which was awkward. The ethics of that are obviously difficult. These were intimate conversations in a marriage between a wife and a husband. They were only being recorded because their privacy was being invaded by their enemy. Those documents, rightfully, legally, should have ended up in the National Archives, where they would have been restricted. They were not restricted because the last Minister of Justice, JM Coetzee, stole them and took them home. So in that sense, they are very much compromised documents. And I mean, I'm probably the last person on earth to give a credible ethical defense for using them. I wanted to use them because I was writing this book. I mean, the fact that they were there and that I could use them, and I was writing a book on a marriage, I just was not going to not use them. Yeah. And the question, I guess, is whether one can use them and preserve their dignity and write about them with great sympathy, despite the content of those transcripts. And I can't judge whether I've done that. I mean, only those who've read the book can do that, and I leave it to them.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm just giving everyone a forewarning that they are going to find themselves in that compromised position, where, as I say, you feel like you are, Swanepoel, interrogating Winnie and sort of not knowing what to do.
Yeah, I mean, you are. It's very, very unusual to eavesdrop on a private conversation between a married couple. It is very invasive.
Mm-hmm. And then the other thing that astounded me about the book, and this is something that I think has been missing in South African writing, is the way in which you write about the human body, and the way in which the human body is actually a historical subject itself, separate from the human beings who inhabit the body. I mean, I found myself again almost sort of astounded at the kind of pettiness of the incarceration of Nelson Mandela and the tormenting of Winnie Mandela, and how your body is so involved in sort of defending yourself against this person who you think of as the enemy, but also how it is that the body's defense is actually to be resilient, that the body is actually so difficult to destroy. So, it's like your enemy pushes you to the brink, but somehow your actual body simply refuses to die. And there's so many moments when you are essentially almost contemplating the philosophical question: when does a human being stop being a human being? When do they start being a human being? And I found myself almost sort of profoundly thinking about these philosophical questions, like what does the body actually do when you are incarcerated? What does the body do when you are banished? And I'm thinking obviously also of someone like Robert Sobukwe, who appears as almost a character in this biography. And how when Robert Sobukwe was released from Robben Island, he felt that his body had been contaminated. He felt that something had been put in his food, and this is why he was dying. And that feeling is so much in your book that I sort of was thinking maybe it should be like a portrait of what happens to the body as a historical subject.
Well, I mean, Nelson and Winnie Mandela's bodies are interesting bodies because they were so supremely self-aware of their bodies while they were free. Mm-hmm. They were both very beautiful people, and they self-consciously used their beauty. How they clothed their bodies was, they understood that it wasn't a frivolous question. They understood that it was what they looked like was politically very, very important. Mm. And both of them, but Winnie as a very, very ambitious woman who was after power in the 1950s, understood that her only access to power as a woman was through her sexuality. Mm-hmm. And at a very young age, from her late teens, she was using it with incredible self-assurance. I mean, when she got engaged to Nelson Mandela, she was engaged to somebody else. And she kept playing these two off against each other, literally until the very last moment. I think at high school, her sexuality was a danger to her. Older men could use it to overpower her and hurt her. She learned very quickly to use it. Mandela as well, 6'2", broad shoulders. He understood that he looked good in a suit, and that for a black man in the 1950s to be dressed in tailored thread and to wear it properly was enormously powerful. And I think that's partly what attracted them to each other. They understood that their marriage, from early on, they understood their marriage was a commodity, that it could be a very, very big deal politically. And that makes their incarceration, both of their incarcerations, all the more tragic in a way. And if you look at the difference between what Mandela looked like physically in 1962 when he went in and when he walked out in 1990, Obviously he's a much older man. But in 1962, there was kind of a fullness to his body, a fleshiness. There was in a sense, it embodied his very exuberant sense of what it meant to be alive. And when he came out, it was this thin, austere, straight, rigid body. What had happened in those 27 years was written into its shape. It's an amazing transformation.
And I think from a contemporary perspective, I'm sure you've heard the term beauty privilege, where people imagine that just because you're beautiful, it means you have an easy life. And I think Winnie in some ways represents exactly the opposite of that. That in some ways her beauty complicated her life and made her life incredibly painful. So I think when people look at these beautiful pictures taken by photographers like Peter Makubane, who we will come to, they think, oh wow, she must have had a charmed life. It was so nice for her to be that beautiful. But actually it may not have been such a comfortable place.
It's a really, that's the last time I'm going to do that.
That's why I just removed my hands.
Somebody tie my hands behind my back. It's really interesting to wonder who she would have been if she hadn't been beautiful, and whether we'd have heard of her, whether we'd be talking about her today. She was really born in struggle. She was one of 11 children in a crazily ambitious family, in a family where the parents made no bones about the fact that they were going to pick winners and forget the losers. And that was very, very traumatic for her as a child. She understood that she would have to be a winner. And so I think she became a very, very determined, calculated, and quite desperate person as a child. She needed to show herself above her siblings. She needed to matter to her father. And at an early age, got into her father's head and occupied a place there. And it's more than just getting his attention. It's literally getting in his innards, in his insides, and being there. And at a young age, she learned to do that with other human beings. She learned to get under somebody's skin immediately and to stay there. It was both a skill and a pathology. I think that in that is both the best of her and the worst of her. Maybe if she wasn't beautiful, she would have found the same energy would have found another resource. It's impossible to know.
No, I think the question really is not whether or not her life would have been different if she had not been beautiful. I think the question is, would her life have been different if beauty was not a commodity at the time? That if she could look into the world and be told that, so I'll tell you what my grandmother used to say. She used to say, what is beauty gonna do for you? Beauty fades. And this is how Granny used to educate us as small children, not to have a mirror complex. Because I think what you see in Winnie is this mirror complex, in which she almost has to have a mirror, a reflection of herself, in order to feel complete as a human being. And as I say, my grandmother used to say, beauty fades. And I think if she had someone tell her that it's only a commodity for a very short period of your life, and then eventually people are looking at your moral character, they are looking at your actions, they don't care that much about how beautiful you are. So I don't know if that changes the question slightly for you, that it's not so much about what would the counterfactual, it's about what if her beauty had meant something different to her. What different choices would she have made?
I think that in order to survive, she had to be charismatic, she had to exude, she had to occupy space in other people's minds, just because of the nature of a very, very difficult childhood. And that if it hadn't been her beauty, it would have been something else. She was a boundaryless person. She could not be alone. Solitude was an enormous, enormous fear for her. She had to command other people. She had to, in a very, very intense way, she had to, in a sense, be what they needed her to be. And her great genius and skill is that she could do that not just across race and class and gender, but across all sorts of divides. But it was also her undoing. In 1969, she went to prison and was interrogated by this man, Tianus Swanepoel. And because she is a boundaryless person, she could not defend herself in that situation. And years later, she hadn't spoken about him publicly for a long time, and suddenly in an interview, 16 years after he interrogated her, he popped up from nowhere in an interview, and she said, from that man, I am that man's child. that man taught me what I know, and what I know is how to hate. He taught me how to hate. I experienced his hatred in close proximity, and I imbibed it, and I hated him back. And she makes a jump from there, and she says, well, therefore, apartheid can only end bloodily, it can only end violently. She jumps from what's inside her to the whole nation, which is another aspect of her which is interesting. But that boundarylessness is both why we know who she is, it's her power, but it's also her enormous vulnerability. She is the wrong sort of human being to survive an interrogation. It scarred her and shaped her forever.
And I want to go back a little bit to that shaping of her by the torture, I'll call it the torture chamber. Because one of the things that shocked me about reading the book is that even though I had taught several Winnie biographies in my career as a professor, one of the things that I often used to say to my students is Winnie Mandela is a reluctant biographical subject. She never wanted anyone to write about her. In fact, she almost always used to refuse interviews, especially by South Africans. She only used to speak to people from abroad. And one of the most disastrous, I was telling some people earlier, one of the most disastrous interviews she has ever given is with V.S. Naipaul. And I think that was one of the last interviews she get, the most disastrous interview you can imagine. She allowed V.S. Naipaul to turn her inside out. And it was exactly almost this, like she was reliving her Swanepoel relationship.
You know, Winnie took a decision early on in her fame that she was going to just lie extravagantly about her childhood. and so, you know, there's biography after biography, and she makes up the most extraordinary stories about her family, which are completely untrue. You know, one is that her grandfather had 29 wives. He actually had 2. You know, another is that her grandmother was a very, very famous, wealthy trading store owner. Her grandmother just stayed at home. I mean, there were these larger-than-life characters, and that was a self-conscious decision. She wanted her privacy, and she made up stories about who she was in order to protect herself. But it made my work as a biographer really interesting. You know, I really felt like Sherlock Holmes, like a detective going into her childhood, and spoke to many of her cousins. I mean, the most valuable source was a cousin, Prince Madikizela, who unfortunately died about a year ago. And it's an incredibly proud and fascinating family history. But when he wanted it all to be concealed, she was a study in opacity. She didn't want people to know her.
This is exactly it. And it's so strange that despite the fact that she's such an opaque figure, people imagine that she is available to be a symbol of black womanhood, a symbol of perseverance, of resilience, of all these things. But actually...
But she is available for all of those things, because while she doesn't want anyone to know who she is, she does want to become what people want.
Yeah.
You know, I've lost count of the number of people, all sorts of people, who they'd met Winnie for 2 hours or an afternoon of their life, and they consider it the most important afternoon of their life, that there was some unbelievably deep and resonant connection. She was so slippery in that sense. She was able to become what people wanted. And I mean, and it spills over into her as a public figure. It's so strange, and it seems so strange to say, but her sense of her place in politics was genuinely aristocratic in a very antiquated, otherworldly way. She believed from early on that because she had married Nelson Mandela, she was the embodiment of black South Africa, and not in a metaphorical sense, but in a real sense. You know, she believed that she was the center point of the revolution because of who she was. Nothing about accountability or decisions or voting. She was it. And she often, you hear her speak, you listen closely, there's this slippage. On the one, you know, she'll be talking about what's happening in her head, and the next moment she's talking about the nation, and she really didn't see the difference. And in that sense, she's quite a frightening figure, because she is enormously powerful. She has enormous psychological power, but she's confusing herself with everybody.
Right.
And for me, that is the populist nightmare. I think that a figure of that power who's confusing herself with everybody it's a very uncomfortable politics for me.
But I think part of the origins of this aristocratic view of politics is actually the mission school. I mean, one of the things that is very difficult to speak about, is how it is that in very many instances, black South Africans have so internalized the lessons of the missionary. Because part of what going to a mission school was about you believing that you are the future leader of your country. So I went to Inanda Seminary, one of the oldest institutions for young women in South Africa. And it was exactly that. The motto of Inanda Seminary is shine where you are. You are supposed to be the change that you want to see in the world. So all the things that people are posting on social media about leadership and all of that, you were taught that at mission schools. And you so internalize it that actually you start to think it's your own voice, that it's your own idea.
You may be right. I'm not sure you are. You may be. But I mean, if you compare her, I mean, look at Nelson Mandela and what he made. You know, he also went to fancy mission schools and then Fort Hare, and was told that because you were a graduate from Fort Hare, you are automatically a leader of your people.
Yes.
And then he went to Johannesburg, and the first few months and year were just utterly humbling for him. You know, he discovered two men he became very close to, Walter Sisulu and Gao Gedebe, and both of them had 6 or 7 years of schooling, never mind university education, and they were much, much cleverer than him and savvier than him and could read the world better than him. And he immediately understood that his degree from Fort Hare meant nothing. He was not a leader of his people. There were much, much better black people than he. It was a very profound and humbling moment. I wonder if Winnie's sense of aristocracy doesn't come from elsewhere, which is, I think that she intuited rather than thought. The moment she and Nelson were together and just looked so powerful together, I think she understood that royalty and that sense of celebrity, that sense that what they exuded was so powerful and could be broadcast to such a large mass of people, that they were leaders through their image. She had a profound understanding of what it meant to be seen.
Right.
And for me, that may be where it comes from.
Because I think there is also a way in which the power couple, as people now call it, is a romance that the two of them created. That at that time, in the 1950s, it was not a given that just because you marry an influential, powerful man, it means that you are going to be a power couple. And again, I will say that the missionaries almost had everything to do with this, because the missionaries profoundly believed that if you build an institution to educate black men, you had to build one to educate black women. Otherwise, where would the black man find partners to marry? And so missionaries were very much invested in the idea of the black people must marry each other and become power couples, because then they become representations of Western modernity and Western or the success of Western modernity and Western civilization. But I want you to talk about how they constructed that myth, because I think that is one of the beauties of your biography, is that you actually go into detail about how it is that this myth of the power couple, this myth of a man and wife or man and woman who live for public adulation, who live for leadership, who live for this kind of national dream. How does that happen?
Well, I mean, in a sense, the story was so obvious that it hit them in the face, where, you know, they were a very famous couple in the late 1950s. Nelson goes underground and becomes the Black Pimpernel. He becomes this mythical figure. And Winnie is the beautiful wife left at home, and journalists come to see her and want to know who she is and want to talk to her. She's the mysterious, powerful man's wife. And then he gets thrown in prison forever, indefinitely. And the story kind of makes itself. It's here as this wonderful, beautiful couple, and they're torn asunder, and they will be reunited on the day their people are free. And in that sense, their marriage comes to embody a struggle for freedom. It's such a simple story and such a compelling story, and they understood that immediately. They understood that that's what their marriage had become. And fortunately for them, a whole lot of other people understood it too. And so in the late 1970s, I mean, the real thinker behind it was Oliver Tambo. He consented to Nelson Mandela's 60th birthday being celebrated by the anti-apartheid movements all over the world. It was a controversial decision for him because the ANC was a collective organization. They didn't believe in the cult of personality. And he very shrewdly and deftly didn't really tell his colleagues what he was doing. If he'd taken it through the National Executive Committee of the ANC, they would have said no. And so a couple of very smart people just understood
I think it's me, actually.
just understood the great power of the story,
Yeah.
and made it into a global story.
Right.
And it was a formidable story. This was the Cold War, where the ANC was struggling. They were trying to square a circle. They were being funded by the Soviet Union. They had Soviet arms. And they were trying to be legitimate in Western capitals. And until the late 70s, it wasn't going that well. And what they did really was, I guess, dumb it down and make it into a romance. Here was a man in jail who shouldn't be in jail. Here was a beautiful woman banned to Brantford who shouldn't be banned. They should be together. They had a media savvy to empty the story of content, and simply to make it a romance. And it was the power of that unbelievably simplistic romance that sort of transcended Cold War divides and made everybody want to love Nelson Mandela and his wife, no matter who they were politically.
Yes.
There was a time so YouGov did a poll in Britain in 1988 about Nelson Mandela, and they found that I think it was 95% of Britons knew who he was, and 70% wanted him free, and even 60% of Tories wanted him free. The story was orchestrated in a way that you couldn't be against Nelson Mandela,
Right.
which at the time was magical. It was bizarre, and a great deal had to do with marriage and how it was projected.
Right. And that magic still lives on. I'm going to talk about the politics, but one of the funny things is that, as a black South African woman, I get through customs in many African countries by just saying, Afrique du Sud, and then the person behind goes, Nelson Mandela, and go, oui, Nelson Mandela, and boom, I'm through. I'm done with immigration. And it's so amazing that the myth, taxi drivers are always asking me about Nelson Mandela. I'm thinking, okay, well, this is the beauty of the myth, but also as you show in the book. Yeah.
Well, I guess what I really, really tried to do in the book above all, I think, was show that there was this terrible irony where they were right. Their marriage did come to embody a nation.
Right.
They were successful, but they lost control over what both their marriage and its embodiment of the nation meant. And the weirdest things happened. Firstly, they ended up being political enemies, and Nelson Mandela didn't know that for a long time. He honestly believed until the last couple of years that he had a loyal wife who was on his side. She had drifted from him politically a mile. As he got more and more moderate and wanted negotiated settlements, she became more and more convinced, not just that it should end violently, but her vision was of a mass armed uprising. Her vision was of literally thousands, if not tens of thousands, of AK-47s being distributed among the masses, and the country blowing itself to freedom. And she tried to orchestrate that behind his back while going to see him in prison. She did it with extraordinary incompetence. It never came close to fruition. There was a lot of violence, but it was not strategically smart violence. But here was this couple that was meant to embody a struggle for freedom and ended up embodying the deepest conflict about it. Another great irony in the marriage is that Mandela's great fears as an elderly man in prison was that his family would be ruined and that his country would be ruined. He wanted his family put back together again, and his greatest fear for his country was civil war. He just had a great wisdom about what mass violence might do and how many generations it might take to recover, and he wanted to avoid that at all costs. And again, he didn't know until late that his wife was the epicenter of what he feared most. That this terrible damage was not just close to home, it was in his very home in Soweto.
Right.
His home in Soweto became a place of violent death again and again and again. And so the ironies are absolutely extraordinary. He's become a very powerful person, but he's locked in prison and he's out of touch. And he's out of touch with things that are very, very deep and close to the heart. Who his wife is, what his family is, what's become of them, and perhaps most important of all, what's become of his nation. He was out to save his nation from something that he didn't know had already happened to them in the late 1980s. He had no idea. I don't think that any of us have properly come to terms with the 1980s and quite how much damage was done. But the damage he so feared was done, while he was trying to stop it. The ironies are extraordinary.
Yes. Before we get to the political ironies, I also want to open up perhaps something that also contributed to my discomfort, which is the pact, the sexual pact that they seem to have agreed on, which was Winnie was free to pursue relationships with other people. And part of what your book is about is also about tracing how disastrous those couplings that Winnie tried to create with other people were. What do you think, or what contribution did that particular pact between them make to the kind of disintegration of this beautiful power couple?
So, you know, when Nelson went to prison when he was 26, and Nelson absolutely understood that she could not be, he didn't expect her to be celibate. He was going away indefinitely and she was young. What he expected was firstly discretion in her sex life, and secondly a personal loyalty, that she would keep the marriage together and keep coming to see him and support him. But most importantly, I think he directly substituted political fidelity for sexual fidelity. And it's when she betrayed him politically that he got very upset rather than sexually. But what happened in her sex life was, there isn't time to discuss it all here, but it was immensely... No,
I don't, because people still have to read the book. So no, you don't have to.
It was immensely complicated, but let me tell one story out of many. In a way, it's quite amusing. I mean, when Mandela went into hiding, when he went deep underground, he picked a distant relative of his, a man called Brian Semana, and instructed this man to look after his wife and children, as an old patriarch does. I mean, he was really an old patriarchal man, Mandela. Yeah. And within short time, Winnie and Brian Semana were lovers. And scandalously, a month before Mandela, the verdict in the Rivonia trial, where everybody thought that Mandela would hang, she invited Semana to come into the house, leave his wife and children, and live with her, and live in her, her and Nelson's bed. Which scandalized the movement. I mean, everybody couldn't believe that this was happening, but it was tolerable. But then what happened next is it was discovered that Brian Semana was a police informer. And two people went to jail directly because of him. One of them ended up with Nelson on Robben Island, and the first thing he did when he saw Nelson was scream at him, right. "Your bloody wife got me here, and what are you going to do about it?" I mean, it was a terrible thing on Robben Island. And at this point, a delegation comes to Winnie and says, "You have to leave this man." And she says, "Absolutely not. Nobody tells me what to do." And the two of them go on together, and that almost destroyed her. I mean, part of her life in the 1960s is shaped by that scandal. It's kind of what ends up getting her in jail in 1969, because she becomes so isolated. Albertina Sisulu refuses to work with her. Lillian Ngoyi refuses to work with her. She ends up, almost as a maverick operator, setting up an underground of her own. And it's a very vulnerable underground, and she gets caught and goes to jail. And the person closest to her in that underground is also a police informer, and the personal information that informer gives the police is used to interrogate her. Tuan Swanepoel knows quite a lot about her by the time he interrogates her, and he's an intelligent man and uses that very well. And I guess the point of the story is that Winnie has absolutely no sense of self-preservation at all. She comes to the brink of self-destruction again and again. When Nelson found out about the Brian Semana thing and that he was an informer and that she refused to leave him, he immediately decided to divorce her. And Walter Sisulu coaxed him back into the marriage on Robben Island. And that is the essence of Winnie's story. It is somebody who is, I think her internal world really is wild and full and on fire and not entirely in control. There's just no sense of looking after herself at all.
Right.
And yet she is also stunningly, superhumanly strong, and she just survives again and again. Terrible, terrible things happen to her, and she does not fall over. She keeps going. She is an absolutely extraordinary and intimidating person to write about. Extraordinary because the richness and the complexity is wonderful for a writer, and intimidating because it is too complex. You're really humbled by the task of trying to put this personality down on paper. Right.
Okay, in another time, I'll offer you my theory of what actually happens to women in Winnie's position. But for now, I would like you to take us into that bifurcation, which I think is part of the story. And it's not just Winnie, it's not just the marriage between Winnie and Nelson that sort of splits into the middle. You have people like Govan Begi, totally sort of also falling for this idea that only an armed struggle would be the perfect sort of coup de grace of the struggle. There can be no other way. You know, the black masses have to be armed and they have to destroy apartheid militarily. And then you have Nelson Mandela and other people taking this sort of charterist path of sort of South Africa belongs to all who live in it, etc. Now, just give the readers, all of the readers, what that storyline is about. You know, why does this bifurcation happen within all? In fact, it's not just the ANC. All of the anti-apartheid movements and anti-apartheid militias and military groupings, but specifically the ANC, and this just split in this vision of a future South Africa.
Well, I think why it happened is a very complex question, and let me duck it and rather talk about how it happened.
Right.
So there's this myth that Robben Island was this wonderful place of unity where people were locked away together and got to understand them very well. It was actually a place of relentless conflict. Governor Mbeki and Nelson Mandela lived, his cell was there, Nelson Mandela was here. They didn't speak to one another. They didn't exchange a word for 4 years. And these people were living on top of each other and living in these factions, these cliques that were not in speaking terms. I mean, it was an unbearable place to live. It made Nelson Mandela want to go. He often wrote, "I'm elsewhere in my imagination. I don't live here." And who would want to live there? It's not just you locked up in prison. You're locked up in prison with fellow comrades who hate you.
Right.
They literally would not greet one another for years. And the issues of the day that split them were manifold, but at bottom is exactly what you were talking about. In 1962, at the beginning of Umkhonto we Sizwe, Governor Mbeki and Joe Slovo wrote a document called Operation Mayibuye, which was meant to be the blueprint of how MK should operate. And reading it now is jaw-dropping in its naivety and its innocence and its romance. I mean, literally they thought that a couple of hundred trained guerrillas would come back into the country, and their very presence would incite such inspiration among the masses that South Africa would rise up. I mean, I'm putting it simplistically, but that's the essence of the narrative. That's the vision. And Governor Mbeki believed that to his dying day, that's how apartheid was going to end. Nelson Mandela went on a very different trajectory. And in 1962, when he was spirited out of the country to go and talk to African leaders, he discovered two very rude facts. And the one is that Africa was turning against the ANC because of its relationship with white people and Indians, which is something we can maybe talk about. But the other thing he discovered is that he met with the Algerian leadership in Morocco after many years of civil war. And they said to him, "You've got to be kidding if you think you can overthrow the apartheid state. We could not overthrow the French, and they were a colonial power far away. You're dealing with a big bureaucratic machine, and thinking that you can overthrow them through armed struggle is just absolute nonsense, and you've got to wake up. If apartheid ever ends, it will be by negotiated settlement. There is no other way, just as we're talking to the French." And Mandela got a huge shock. But from early on, from 62, he absolutely understood that the ANC's formal program of people's war was a fantasy. And while Governor Mbeki was in Robben Island, teaching courses on Marx and Lenin, and if there was time, Gramsci, Nelson Mandela was reading the biographies of powerful white men because he wanted to talk to them. I mean, he knew that the future lay in understanding what was in their heads and how to defeat them around a table. And so he was reading biographies of Kruger, of De La Rey, of Kennedy when they started to come out, of Churchill. He understood that his place in history was around the big table because that's where matters would be decided.
So I think we should pause and open for questions so that the audience can participate. I'm sorry that I've mostly had my back to this part of the room, so now I can look at you. So you have to ask all the questions. Woo. keeps happening. Okay, let me try and rearrange. I think it's me. Okay. Do we have the mic? Could we? I should have said at the beginning that it is being recorded, right? This interview is being recorded. So if you feel awkward about having your words recorded, then I'm telling you now that it's being recorded. So, any takers, any questions? Oh, there you go.
I've been captivated, Jonny, and moderator. Yesterday I actually read a review by Bill Johnson. I don't know if you've seen it.
Yeah.
But he basically says that you hold back because you're aiming this book at the American audience. It seems he was a bit harsh there. Maybe we can solicit a comment from you.
Well, he says that I don't go far enough in saying that Mandela was a communist, and the reason is that he wasn't a communist. Rather, quite simply. So, Mandela's relation to the Communist Party and to Marxism was really interesting. So he arrived in Johannesburg as a Christian, as a practicing, believing Methodist, and within 2 or 3 years had essentially become an atheist. And it's such a typical mid-century story of an educated young man moving from the countryside to the city and discovering, in this instance, historical materialism, the work of Karl Marx, which he got, primarily from Walter Sisulu and another older man called Gao Khadebe, and it was revolutionary for him it was really his first confrontation with analytical thought, the idea that society was an object that could be studied and analyzed and torn apart and put together again. And it was a huge business for him. But it didn't translate into being a signed-up, committed communist at all. He was above all an incredibly pragmatic person. And taking something useful from one body of theory didn't mean being possessed by it. It sit alongside many, many other things he learned. He was an amazingly adaptable, flexible person. He would take what was useful and take only that parts that were useful and then move on. And it was useful to him to think through parts of the world through Marxism. It was useful to him to have communist allies. But you could see where his true colors lay when, as I was alluding to, he went on this African trip in 1962 and discovered that the ANC was losing credibility all across Africa because of its relationship with the Communist Party and white people and Indian people. And the result is that he dropped them overnight. He came home and said, we can no longer publicly be with communists or with white people or Indian people. So when push came to shove, he revealed that he was an African nationalist. And I think that's the truth of his relation to being a communist.
If I can also interject here, John, before we take another. One of the things that I didn't mention about the book is that in fact, the things that Jonny sidesteps are all the conspiracy theories that have circulated around. So the whole question of Nelson Mandela, whether he was, has become a huge conspiracy theory because every time someone says Nelson Mandela was a communist, it's linked to 500 different other things that could and couldn't have happened in South Africa. So, for example, the assassination of Chris Hani is often linked to the fact that Nelson Mandela deserted the communists. Thabo Mbeki wanted to remove Chris Hani because of... So there's all these conspiracy theories. And I think you sort of sidestep them precisely because they are actually a distraction. Because after a while, you simply cannot get the sort of head or tail of it. And Paul Landau has written an entire book about Nelson Mandela as a communist. And so I think maybe some people also need to read some more. They need to buy books. I think you are the second person, so if you could just wait for the microphone. And if you'd like, you can tell people your name as well, so that afterwards the conversations can continue.
My name's Danny Cohen. Hi, Jonny.
Hi, Danny.
A question around the party and the family. So has there been any direct response from the ANC, leadership in the ANC around the book? And Nelson's family and Grassa, has there been any reaction to the book?
It's too early. So the officials from the Nelson Mandela Foundation read the book shortly before it was published, and they had separate meetings with the Mandela family. Is a complicated institution, so they had to have 3 separate meetings with 3 parts of the Mandela family to tell them about the book, and they met with the ANC and told them. But I don't believe the book's basically out today, I think. So so that's as far as things have got.
Mm-hmm. There's a question on that side.
Thanks. Thanks, Jonny, for the contribution. I mean, my interaction with Winnie, would you say it's fair to say that at some point she just started hating white people? And she just hated white people?
No, she was always much more complex than that. You know, I think to begin to appreciate Winnie and to understand Winnie is to understand that, and Nelson for that matter, is that very, very opposite, paradoxical and contradictory things could sit with them both. I mean, that's part of their power. That's part of their complexity. And so, let me give you an example, and this is not about white people, it's about homosexuality. You know, Winnie had, you know, very famously had four young men and a boy interrogated and beaten in her house on the grounds that they had slept with a white priest. And she said to him that they were disgraced black people for doing that, and that they had insulted Nelson Mandela personally. And yet that very same woman had very close friends who were openly and proudly gay, and she celebrated them. And I think that one needs to grasp that level of fluidity and complexity and contradiction. And so no, absolutely, she did not uniformly hate white people at all. She was, you know, Winnie was able to get inside anybody's skin. She was able to get emotionally very, very intimate with, literally with any human being. And she could do it like that, at the click of her fingers, shortly after meeting somebody, and it didn't matter if they were white or black or where in the world they came from. Her capacity to inhabit another was, it knew no bounds, and it didn't until she died. There are extraordinary stories of her in her last days and last weeks, and her very intense interactions. I mean, among other people, with her white priest, Gary Rivas. So no, absolutely, yeah, that's just not the sum of her at all. It's just a much more complex and interesting story than that.
Okay, I see a question there. Can you take the mic there? And again, if you don't mind, you can tell us your name.
Hi, my name's Andrew. I work with a gentleman called Christo Brunt, who you write about in your book. And there's a remarkable story in the book about how Winnie smuggled her grandchild onto Robben Island. And Christo, as a young guard, took the baby from her and gave it to Nelson Mandela to hold. Years later, she wrote in a book where she thanked him for what he'd done. And she said, "God bless you. You're an amazing person." So that story was an incredible story, and that proved that, you know, she completely admired Christo for what he had done, and she would often thank him for what he had done for Madiba in prison, because she appreciated what he had done.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, one of the loveliest things about rereading Nelson Mandela's autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, is understanding in retrospect how much he was protecting Christo Brunt when he wrote that book. Because when he wrote that book, Brunt was still working for the prison service. And Brunt could have got himself fired 2 times for the rules he broke to help Nelson Mandela. And you read carefully, there are certain things that Christo did for Mandela that Mandela wants the world to know, but he doesn't want them to know that Christo did it. Because Christo would get fired if the world knew. So there are these little lies, these little white lies all over Long Walk to Freedom. It was, yeah, the relationship between Mandela and Christo Brunt was a fascinating one, and in the end, one of deep trust. You know, towards the end, Brunt was really more Mandela's personal assistant than anything else. He was, you know, there was a time when Zinzi, Nelson's daughter, was studying at UCT, because Nelson wanted her close by so that he could watch over her. But he was in prison. Watching over her meant sending Christo Brunt to go and see her twice a day. And so So he literally used Christo to watch over and I guess spy on his own daughters. So Christo Brandt got intimately involved in the Mandela family world through his remarkable relationship with Nelson Mandela.
And I will interject and say, I think you have to read the descriptions that you give of actually what was going on between the two men in order to really fully appreciate what that relationship meant for the future of the country. Because I think those are the relationships that in some ways changed Nelson Mandela, and the same did not happen for Winnie in some profound ways. So I think you have to read Jonny Steinberg's description of Christo Brandt's relationship with Mandela, and just even the way that he would indicate to Mandela that he was bugged, and he would sort of make gestures to show him where the bugs were, and then ask him the question that he'd been asked to ask. And so in a way sort of tell Mandela, they are listening to us, so you better answer in a way that suits you. And here are the bugs, and this is where they are. And this is why I say you have to read the descriptions to fully comprehend what the relationship meant to both of them, I think.
Absolutely.
Any other questions? Oof. This. Oh, did I? Oh, there you are. I think somebody here had a hand up. Okay, I'll take.
There's one at the back.
Oh, the hands are multiplied. Okay, let's start at the back.
All right, I've got the mic. Hi, I'm Sharad. I have a question, Jonny, about the uses of the romance at different moments. So you made an argument that the romance self-consciously was crafted to, in a particular moment, to personalize the movement and to shift, in order to galvanize international support, right? And then seems like there's another moment where the divorce or the breakup is crucial for galvanizing consent internally during the transition, right? I wanted you to comment on that. And then what is it that you want the story to do today, given the very different positions across the social landscape in South Africa, particularly around Winnie? What do you want? What's the story? What's the work that you want to do with this text?
Sorry, Jonny, before you answer, I'm an academic, so I can go on for the rest of the afternoon. But I was made aware of the fact that these venues have to be changed over. And so would you mind if we took several questions and then you can answer the questions in succession? I think
we have 2 minutes, so let's take maybe one or two more.
Okay, I saw a hand. Do you still want to ask a question? And then that hand, and then the lady at the back. Let's just take those three.
Hi, thank you. My name is Marco. It's fascinating to understand the fairy tale that happened over a long period of time and how the armed struggle didn't happen, it didn't explode. And I'm thinking in the back of my mind that maybe if it did explode, we would all be living in a different South Africa today. Not worse, by the way, because I think that romance and that fairy tale lingered along for a long time and eventually just started crumpling. And it never really got properly tested. And I think sadly, we're suffering for that today. Now, it's clearly not not writing about that, but I just can't help thinking about that, listening to your eloquent presentation here. Thank you.
Okay, so the last two questions. And I know that so many questions are still going to be neglected, but as I say, I was made aware that these rooms need to change over, so we cannot go over a minute. So 2 questions, yours and then the young lady at the back.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for a great dialogue. As a country, as this generation, perhaps my generation, we just know perhaps of one relationship that who Mam Winnie had. We didn't know about the others, and it's a revelation. My question wants to go to the figures that we now look up to, because you make the assertion that the divorce was really caused by the political differences more than the principle. It was to say, leave whatever, you could have been sleeping around, that's not the issue. Do you make any inroads in talking to having high moral leaders, well-renowned, not talking or keeping to positive family values.
Clip, I wonder if we shouldn't end here because it is 2:30, and if I should answer those and then.
I think we should just for the sake of fairness, I think we should take, because she had her hand up. I'll deal with the powers that be, John. You had a hand up at the back. Are you okay with not asking your question? I think there was a hand up at the back. No? Okay, so I think that's it there.
Very briefly. So this last question, you know, it is so very, very hard to separate the political and the personal in this marriage. But I think that if you'd asked Nelson Mandela, he would have said that his reasons for divorcing her were deeply personal and not political. I think that in the end he felt that they'd both waited 27 years and he was prepared to give it a bash and she wasn't. And she humiliated him serially. That would be his position. There are other positions. There are people who steadfastly hold that the ANC decided that for political reasons he needed to divorce her. But I think that for him, he was so angry with her that, you know, as he left her, his autobiography was being finalized, and he called the publisher at the very last moment and said, "Take every picture of that woman out of my book. I don't want to see her there." He was. It was, the feelings were very, very deep, very, very powerful, and they were of rage and anger. It was deeply personal. I don't think it was a political decision at all. On the question of what work do I want to do, I don't really want to have an answer to that. I want to, you know, write a book that's open and that people make something of. But for me, I think it's amazing that Winnie was able, not very long ago, so effectively to retell the story of the marriage in a way that spoke very powerfully and deeply to people who were not born under apartheid. You know, and briefly what she said is that, and it's quite cruel what she said that Nelson Mandela was divorced from black experience under apartheid. He was wrapped in cotton wool. He didn't know suffering and pain as we knew it. And I, on the other hand, Winnie Mandela, embodied black pain. I embodied black experience. And if I'd been in control in the early 90s, I wouldn't have compromised. We would have fought. That's the essence of how she retold the story of the marriage. And it's deeply resonant for a lot of young people now. So, I mean, amazingly, this marriage is alive and well. You know, both partners are dead. The people it's speaking to now were not even born when those two separated. And yet, as a fiery, on fire public institution, that marriage remains very much alive.
Wow, that is a very powerful way to end our conversation. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
And get yourself a copy of the book. Get yourself a copy of the book. See, people are already waving their copies.